Welcome to A Tale of Two Kitties. I'm Mr. Level, and these are my kitties. Similar to reading Shakespeare with cats, I will be reading a few segments of A Tale of Two Cities to you, for you. Unlike Shakespeare for cats, I'm not going to read the whole thing this way, so take advantage when it's here. Go ahead and drop your cats and again, take your book out of its case, and we will begin. Now, some of you might not have a book in front of you, so if you want to go ahead and split screen so you can see the online text while seeing over here, or just listen as we go along, that would be fine. We're starting with a chapter that is unlike any other chapter in the book. It doesn't really begin the story as much as it describes the setting of the story. It's going to read a little bit like an essay almost of this period, this time period. It's called Chapter 1, The Period. But don't let that throw you off. The rest of the book will dive into characters and so forth. So this is definitely a unique chapter, and it begins with probably the most famous opening line in, I don't know, literature written in English. So, book the first, recalled to life. Chapter 1, The Period. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief, it was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light, it was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope, it was the winter of despair. We had everything before us, we had nothing before us. We were all going direct to heaven, we were all going direct the other way. In short, the period was so far like the present period that some of its noisiest authorities insisted on its being received, for good or for evil, in the superlative degree of comparison only. Okay, it's a big sentence. It's a famous one. You've probably heard that quoted before. You have these opposites side by side here. It was the best of times, worst of times, and so forth. Wisdom, foolishness, belief, incredulity, light, darkness. What I want you to consider is that part. How is that true of Dickens' time, of the time he's writing about? Now, you notice it's called The Period. Chapter 1 is. That's because he's writing about the time period. He's not writing about his own time period. He's writing about 1775, before the American Revolution even, but about 15 years before the French Revolution. So that's the time period he's describing, is before the French Revolution. And he says that that was a time that was the best or is the worst. And you might think about how that could be possible. How could it be both the best and the worst? The first part of the sentence usually makes quite a bit of sense to everyone. And then we get to that dash, and suddenly the sentence gets pretty confusing. So let's break it down. In short, the period was so far like the present period. The period is 1775, and he's saying it's so far like the present period. Dickens is writing this in 1859. So many, many years later, he's writing this, and he says that that time was so similar to this time today that some of its noisiest authorities insisted on its being received for good or for evil in the superlative degree of comparison only. Okay, its noisiest authorities might be described as those who are authorities on that time period, perhaps historians, and that the noisiest of them, the ones who make the most noise about it, insist that we receive it either as a time of good or a time of evil, but it has to be described in the superlative degree of comparison only. In terms of superlative means the best, the worst, the fastest, the slowest, the EST, right? And that's the only way we could look at this time period. We couldn't look at it anywhere in between. Okay. There were a king with a large jaw and a queen with a plain face on the throne of England. There were a king with a large jaw and a queen with a fair face on the throne of France. In both countries, it was clearer than crystal to the lords of the state preserves of loaves and fishes that things in general were settled forever. Again, we might get jumbled into that, but he starts off with this wonderful sentence describing the king and queen of England and then the king and queen of France. King and queen of England would be George III, think American Revolution, and his queen was Charlotte. And then you have the king and queen of France would be Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. And the way he describes them here is interesting. I want you to pay attention to his tone. How respectful of a description is this of them? Not very. He basically just says it's a guy with a big jaw and a lady with a plain face, and then a guy with a big jaw and a lady with a fair face. So in other words, the only difference between the two seems to be that one's got a little bit better looking queen. But other than that, the two countries are sounding pretty similar. And Dickens is showing a lack of respect, an intentional lack of respect to the kings and queens of that time period. In both countries, it was clearer than crystal to the lords of the state preserves of loaves and fishes that things in general were settled forever. Okay, to read this sentence the first time, cut out that part about the loaves and fishes. Just say, in both countries, it was clearer than crystal that things in general were settled forever. Settled forever, in other words, people think, or especially the higher ups think, that this is basically how things are and how they're going to continue to be forever after. Both countries are about to experience a revolution, the American Revolution for England, and then you have the French Revolution coming up for France. So there's some irony to that line. But what about this? What's up with this line about the preserves of loaves and fishes? If we go to Discovering Dickens, which is well worth it, I'm going to go here and we're going to see the phrase clearer than crystal is a biblical reference. And then moving down, it's going to point out that the loaves and fishes, on the other hand, refer to the miracle performed by Christ in Matthew 14:17-21, the multiplication of loaves and fishes to feed the faithful. But Jesus said unto them, they need not depart back to the village for food. Give ye them to eat. And they said unto him, we have here but 5 loaves and 2 fishes. He said, bring them hither to me. And he commanded the multitude to sit down on the grass, and took the 5 loaves and the 2 fishes, and looking up to heaven, he blessed and brake, and gave the loaves to his disciples, and the disciples to the multitude. And they all did eat, and were filled. And they took up the fragments, and that remained 12 baskets full. And they that had eaten were about 5,000 men, besides women and children. So if you're unfamiliar with the story, there it is. Now, what I like about Discovering Dickens is it's also going to give us some analysis of that to help us make sense of the purpose of that allusion. Dickens' allusion to this miracle is highly ironic, as his lords of the state preserves of loaves and fishes are the French and English aristocrats for whom hunting is a leisure sport. The loaves and fishes of aristocratic game reserves were kept for entertainment, not nourishment, and the preserves preserve the game from distribution to the hungrier classes. In short, Dickens' loaves and fishes are not used to feed a multitude, but to entertain an unhungry few. And there's a lot more on Discovering Dickens than you'll ever want to read, but it's a great resource if you want to check it out at some point. Okay, we're not going to go that slowly through this book or we'll never make it. Let's move on to the next paragraph. It was the year of our Lord 1775. Spiritual revelations were conceded to England at that favored period, as at this. And here, the word favored is ironic because what he's talking about, spiritual revelations, those would be seeing the revealing of ghosts, of spirits. And he says that those were conceded to England. In other words, England got to see a lot of those at that favored period. Oh, what a favor that was. As at this. And he suggests that now today we still are favored in getting to see spirits and ghosts and so forth. Mrs. Southcott had recently attained her 25th blessed birthday, of whom a prophetic private in the Life Guards had heralded the sublime appearance by announcing that arrangements were made for the swallowing up of London and Westminster. Even the Cock Lane ghost had been laid only a round dozen of years after rapping out its messages as the spirits of this very last past, supernaturally deficient in originality, rapped out theirs. Okay, so there's 2 things he refers to here. Again, both of these I found on Discovering Dickens, this time in the glossary of historical things section. But Mrs. Southcott, ultimately, she was a self-proclaimed prophet living in the 18th century England, whose many followers believed the world would end in 2004. That would be a prophecy fail. And on top of that, the Cock Lane ghost, okay? He references the Cock Lane ghost, who had been around only about a dozen years at that point. And the idea of the Cock Lane ghost was that people on this road called Cock Lane were very scared of a ghost. They thought there was a ghost. They heard these knocking noises at night, and they thought them to be a ghost. It turned out to be a hoax, that there was a boy who was knocking on his headboard at bedtime, and everybody freaked out about it and believed it was a ghost. That's how people are in England at this time. What is he establishing about them? They're very superstitious. And he also points out that that was happening in his own time, as the spirits of this very last past, supernaturally deficient in originality. He's throwing shade at them because they didn't even come up with an original thing. They just, apparently someone just the year before he wrote this, decided to do the same. Mere messages in the earthly order of events had lately come to the English crown and people from a Congress of British subjects in America, which, strange to relate, have proved more important to the human race than any communications yet received through any of the chickens of the Cock Lane brood. Weird. Again, Dickens is throwing shade with his tone here. He's quite the social critic. And what he's pointing out is that mere messages, just mere messages in the earthly order, in other words, actual messages, not ones, that you would receive from ghosts and spirits and prophets and so forth, that those actual messages had lately, in 1775, come to the English crown from some subjects in America. What message might that have been? We don't want to be part of England anymore. And then he suggests that strangely enough, those proved to be more important than any of the communications that anyone got from any of the chickens on Cock Lane. Weird. Let's shift to France. France, less favored on the whole as to matters spiritual than her sister of the shield and trident, rolled with exceeding smoothness downhill, making paper money and spending it. Okay, so France is less favored when it comes to these spiritual revelations, but she's rolling with exceeding smoothness straight downhill. Things are not going well. She's making paper money and spending it. You might recall that before the French Revolution, there was a period of massive spending by the aristocracy, by the king. They built Versailles. They funded the American Revolution. They did not fund what? Food for people in their country. Under the guidance of her Christian pastors, she entertained herself, besides, with such humane achievements as sentencing a youth to have his hands cut off, his tongue torn out with pincers, and his body burned alive because he had not kneeled down in the rain to do honor to a dirty procession of monks which passed within his view at a distance of some 50 or 60 yards. I always read that part with a little bit of anger because I note that the details of that are shifting. You look at how vicious and violent those images are. With his body burned alive, his tongue torn out with pincers, his hands cut off, all of these things. And why? This happened to some boy because what? Because he didn't kneel down to do honor to some monks, some dirty monks, Dickens calls them, who are passing by in the rain. That's the state of things in France. This can also be found in Discovering Dickens. There's a story quite like this one that was a real event. It is likely enough that, rooted in the woods of France and Norway, there were growing trees when that sufferer was put to death, already marked by the woodman, fate, to come down and be sawn into boards to make a certain movable framework with a sack and a knife in it, terrible in history. The sentence is tough for a lot of readers. First time through, it seems like he just jumped to something completely different. But there's a good transition here. His connection is he's talking about when that sufferer was put to death. So when that poor young boy was killed so brutally for not adhering to religious practice, when that happened, there was at the same time something else going on in France. There were trees growing, and those trees were already being marked to one day become something. The something, if you can't guess at it, is a framework with a sack and a knife in it. The sack is heavy and holds the blade up in the air, and then you cut the sack's cord and the blade comes down. He's talking about the guillotine, okay? In other words, the guillotine wasn't made yet. They didn't have the guillotine in 1775, but there were trees that were already marked. By whom? By the woodman, fate. He personifies this woodman as one who is going to make this happen, that these boards are going to be cut down and turned into the guillotine. He's going to echo this exact sentence with another one like it. It is likely enough that in the rough outhouses of some tillers of the heavy lands adjacent to Paris, there were sheltered from the weather that very day rude carts, bespattered with rustic mire, snuffed about by pigs, and roosted in by poultry, which the farmer, Death, had already set apart to be his tumbrils of the Revolution. If you check out the glossary that I have, words like tumbrils are defined in there, but a tumbril is a cart, ultimately. Okay? So at the same time, that what else was there? There were these carts out on farms, and they were just being, they're just being snuffed about by pigs and roosted in by poultry, normal stuff at that point, but they were already set aside, these carts, by the farmer. And he describes the farmer, he personifies Death here, that Death has already set these aside for what? The carts are going to one day bring the victims from the jail to the guillotine. That's something that happened in the French Revolution. So during these mass executions, they brought people in on carts, not just one person. They bring in lots of people by the dozens in carts because they were executing that many people. And he's saying that that's already been marked by the farmer. The farmer already has this, not present in the front of his mind, but in the back of his mind. But that woodman and that farmer, though they work unceasingly, work silently, and no one heard them as they went about with muffled tread. The rather, for as much as to entertain any suspicion that they were awake, was to be atheistical and traitorous. Okay, so they work unceasingly, meaning they're not stopping their work towards what? Towards a revolution. That's happening. But they work silently, and no one's hearing them. Who's the no one? The no one's particularly the nobility. And the rather, in fact, the nobles would not hear them specifically because to entertain any suspicion that they were awake, they would be the woodman and the farmer, would be atheistical and traitorous. Traitorous is easy. It means they thought that it was, oh no, you're going against your country to suggest that anyone could ever rise up and overthrow our king. He has such a plain jaw. But then, on the other hand, atheistical, how so? They thought it would be going against God to overthrow a king. That it would be atheistical then. It would be anti-religious to even suggest that, I think those people aren't too happy and they might want to, kill us. Let's go back to England. In England, there was scarcely an amount of order and protection to justify much national boasting. Okay, so things aren't going so well there either. They don't have much to brag about in terms of order and protection. That's our topic sentence, and like an essay, the rest of this paragraph is going to be examples of how order and protection are not really the big thing in England at this time. Daring burglaries by armed men and highway robberies took place in the capital itself every night. Families were publicly cautioned not to go out of town without removing their furniture to upholsterers' warehouses for security. The highwayman in the dark was a city tradesman in the light, and, being recognized and challenged by his fellow tradesmen, whom he stopped in his character of the captain, gallantly shot him through the head and rode away. Okay, let's pause on that one. A highwayman is a thief, is a robber along a road. And if he's a highwayman in the dark, what does he do during the day? He's a city tradesman during the day. That makes sense because now what does he have? He has all these, wares that he's stolen in the night that now he can sell during the day. And what happens here apparently is he was recognized in his character of the captain. That's just sort of like his I don't know, like I'm the captain. When he's robbing people, apparently that's his persona. And in his role of the captain, he was recognized by someone. The guy with the tent right next to him is like, Gary, is that you? And unfortunately, Gary's like, oh, shoot. Well, I better shoot him now. So that's what he did. He shot him in the head and he rode away. The male was waylaid by 7 robbers, and the guard shot 3 dead, and then got shot dead himself by the other 4 in consequence of the failure of his ammunition. After which, the male was robbed in peace. He makes it sound like it's a good thing, like, oh, the male was robbed in peace. But it's after, of course, this big bloodshed. That magnificent potentate, the Lord Mayor of London, was made to stand and deliver on Turnham Green by one highwayman who despoiled the illustrious creature in sight of all of his retinue. In other words, the mayor was robbed in front of everyone by one highwayman. That's all it took because everyone else was too scared to stop him. Prisoners in London jails fought battles with their turnkeys. And yes, G-A-O-L-S says jails. It just means jails. That's fun. Prisoners fought battles with their turnkeys, and the majesty of the law fired blunderbusses in among them, loaded with rounds of shot and ball. A blunderbuss is a shotgun. Thieves snipped off diamond crosses from the necks of noble lords at court drawing rooms. Musketeers went into St. Giles to search for contraband goods, and the mob fired on the musketeers, and the musketeers fired on the mob, and nobody thought any of these occurrences much out of the common way. That's how Dickens thinks of it. So normal that, this is how things are in England. In the midst of them, the hangman, ever busy and ever worse than useless, was in constant requisition. Now stringing up long rows of miscellaneous criminals, now hanging a housebreaker on Saturday who had been taken on Tuesday, now burning people in the hand at Newgate by the dozen, and now burning pamphlets at the door of Westminster Hall. Today taking the life of an atrocious murderer, and tomorrow of a wretched pilferer who had robbed a farmer's boy of 6 pence. Okay, there's a big comment there in Dickens' sentence right there. It's a big one. He suggests that the hangman is ever busy and ever worse than useless. What does it mean if the hangman is worse than useless? He's useful. If the hangman's useful, that's worse. You'd rather him be useless. But the hangman's hanging a lot of people. And he lists off all the people he's hanging up or stringing up. And you have some of them, like a housebreaker on Saturday who had been taken on Tuesday. What's Dickens suggesting there? He's suggesting that it's an injustice for him to be arrested on Saturday and then arrested on Tuesday and then hanged on Saturday. That's 5 days. That's not enough time to really seek out justice here. Also, that he's burning people, just like he's burning pamphlets. And then today, taking the life of an atrocious murderer, and tomorrow of a wretched pilferer. Okay, a pilferer is someone who steals a small amount of money, like 6 pence. And that's all he stole. And the same consequence applies to him, same punishment for him as for the atrocious murderer. Dickens is throwing some shade at the justice system in England here. All these things, and 1,000 like them, came to pass in and close upon the dear old year 1775. What a dear old year that sounds like, right? What a wonderful year. Sounds like 2020. Environed by them, while the woodman and the farmer worked unheeded, those two of the large jaws and those other two of the plain and the fair faces trod with stir enough and carried their divine rights with a high hand. So while all this is going on, what are the kings and queens doing? They're just holding their heads up high and feeling like they're doing pretty well because you know what? They don't care. Thus did the year 1775 conduct their greatnesses and myriads of small creatures, the creatures of this chronicle among the rest, along the roads that lay before them. So again, now the year is personified as conducting us, as guiding us. There's kind of almost a Macbethian image of fate here to it, that these greatnesses, that would be the kings and queens, along with a lot of small creatures, in other words, just common, normal people. And he, in this little interruption, tells us that the creatures of this chronicle, among the rest, that's who this story of this book is going to be about, is the small creatures, or some of them. It's not really, there's some nobles, but it's not really about the king and queen. They're not really characters in this story. And then it conducts us along the roads that lay before us, that we have these roads, which is another image of fate in a way, this path that you have in front of you that you're going to follow, and we're going to follow this. Dickens is not suggesting that all life is just fate, but he does have some comments about fate, and he certainly looks back at history as being somewhat fated, that there's no way to avoid it. These revolutions are coming, the good and the bad with that. It will be the best of times and the worst. Okay, that's the first chapter.